Joining us right now is political commentator and best-selling author Mark Steyn. Mark, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So what do you make about this latest polling?
Well, I don't recall a poll asking whether Americans would be embarrassed. I don't recall anyone asking that when John Kerry... I would frankly be embarrassed at having John Kerry as president because his French is un peu déclassé for my taste. But it makes... I mean, it's an extraordinary poll. It makes America sound like a dowager duchess sitting opposite a guy, Trump, while he's breaking wind on the subway. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. You know what? This Quinnipiac guy says half of American voters say they'd be embarrassed to have Donald Trump as their commander-in-chief. You know what Americans ought to be embarrassed about? That they spend over 40% of the planet's military expenditure, and in 15 years, they can't win a war against goat herds with fertilizer. Yep. They ought to be embarrassed that this is the brokest country in the history of brokenness, and that the party that is supposed to be the fiscally responsible party passes a $1 trillion budget bill that promises to reduce by 0.003% the rate of the increase of the decline of the rate of the increase of growth in the year 2037. Yeah, That's what they ought to be embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that Americans are embarrassed by this.
Yeah,
this is ridiculous.
You're right, though. No one ever asks, are you going to be embarrassed by... I mean, where does this come from? It's
and by the way,
Monica.
The founding fathers designed the system for citizen leaders. Right. So they wanted people to come out of all walks of life, go to Washington, serve their country for a little while, and then go back. This is what Donald Trump is, in fact, doing. And by the way, there was a Morning Consult study that was released yesterday. Morning Consult is a polling and research, a market research firm. Right. And what they found was that a lot of these polls might be underestimating Trump's support for this very reason, that people might be embarrassed to tell the pollster they support him, but they
That's what I said to Mike earlier. They may say this just because they think this sounds good, but when they get in the voting booth, I bet you they vote for Trump.
And Donald Trump knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how to build an image. He's done it for years, and he's out there right now. And I think he knows the buttons he wants to press, and he's pressing those. So I think at this stage of the game, it's his election to lose.
I think that's actually true. I mean, what we're up against here is he took out a $100 million candidate, Jeb Bush, with an adjective. And as he said there, he's done the same to an awful lot of these other fellas in the race. And that's brilliant. And instead of saying, oh, frankly, when he comes to the RNC cocktail party for Christmas, we're all a little embarrassed to have him in the room, they ought to be actually thinking, wow, this guy didn't spend a dime, and he turned Jeb Bush into the most expensive loser in the history of presidential
Jeb Bush isn't out of the race yet. His numbers are getting better in New Hampshire. I think it's a bit early to call people out of the race. So what do you think about him being behind Cruz in Iowa, either of you?
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think that Trump isn't necessarily a good fit for Iowa. It would be damaging to him in the first contest if he were to lose badly.
Do you think he loses momentum going into New Hampshire and South Carolina? If he
no, I think at this stage it's very hard to see who the mainstream alternative to Trump would be. Right now, basically, as far as the Republican establishment is concerned, it's a contest between two crazy guys. They hate Trump, they despise Trump, they condescend to Trump, but they absolutely loathe Ted Cruz. And if you take out, if you take out Carson, if you take out Rubio, if you take out these other guys, and it comes down to a two-man race between Trump and Cruz, that is like the disaster.
And what will they do? Who will they choose?
Well, I don't know. Nothing works. Who are they? I mean, there's all this talk about, oh, we're going to have a brokered convention with Mitt Romney coming through to save the day for the Republican establishment.
They're not listening to the people.
No, otherwise they can slip a potion into the Chief Justice's into Chief Justice's coffee on inauguration morning, and maybe that'll save the day for them. But it's getting later and later.
The support for the outsiders, whether it's Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, this is basically the latest incarnation of the Tea Party movement. This is Tea Party 2.0. The establishment loathes them. Mark is absolutely right, but they fear them even more because all of these outsiders, in particular Trump, but Cruz also, they promised to blow up the system. And you know what? So many of these voters are supporting them because they want the establishment burned to the ground.
But they're going to blow up the system and lose the election. There's no way I will sit here and the day after the election day in 2016, Trump and Cruz will not win the presidency.
That's what I want to talk about. Let's talk about that.
Trump has got great bipartisan appeal. In all the broken down loser parts of this country, country, and I use that term broadly just to describe the place. Just to describe the kind of places where there's no economic opportunity. I mean, this country has less economic mobility than Canada, than Europe, than the United States.
How did that happen?
Well, I think it happened because essentially we bifurcated into a society where if you happen to have the right six-figure credentials, you're on an escalator to a reasonably comfortable life. But if you're people whose fathers worked in mills and whose grandparents were farmers and yet whose kids are just heroin addicts because there's nothing else to do. I'm describing, by the way, bucolic, picture-perfect, Ben and Jerry-fied Vermont across the river from me where I live.
But I want to be the voice of dissent
Wow.
here, because I do think it's important to point out that not everyone who agrees with Trump is just some sort of establishment that's scared of him. There's legitimate reasons to not like what he said, some of the racist things that he said about Muslims. As a foreign policy person, I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. What he says about Putin scares me. Okay, so you don't have to be a part of the establishment to be worried about how is he going to effectively govern foreign policy for this country. And I'm sorry, some of the stuff he says, you don't have to be a part of the establishment to find it disturbing.
Well,
It's a fair point. It's true.
There was a poll that showed on the end to Muslim immigration, for example, that if you take Trump out of that position, 45% of Democrats agree that there should be an end to Muslim immigration. So that's one of the, that's what they say on Broadway. Nobody likes it but the public.
But it's about how you say things that matter. After 9/11, why was President Bush so effective in leading this country? Because it's about what he said after 9/11 to make sure that he understood that not all Muslims are against him.
Well, the truth is when you ask the other candidates, they basically have the same plan as Trump. But they're not saying it the way that he is.
I think tone matters.
Tone does matter. And you know that the problem here, Morgan, is that maybe not most, but a significant chunk of Americans look at John Kerry standing in Paris when they're swabbing the blood from the streets. And John Kerry says this is nothing to do with Islam. Actually, no, that's crazier than anything Trump says.
So, but let's not be as crazy as them.
Well, this is a really good point, and I think when the president was at the Paris summit, he really did miss the zeitgeist of the country. I mean, the people were so scared after Paris, I mean, after the terrorist attack there, but he still was just reluctant to call it what it was.
And to Mark's point, the reason Trump has so much traction and the reason his numbers went up, not down after those comments, is because the American people understand the nature of the threat. And they're so sick and tired of having it sugar-coated.
Real quick, do you think Trump or Cruz can win the general election?
Yes, absolutely. I think Trump's been underestimated. If they thought he was a joke candidate who would implode, he didn't. He's going up. His ceiling goes up and up. And if he wins the nomination, it'll be the same thing.
So you believe... And
actually, I think with Cruz, too.
You believe the polls? Because a lot of people debate whether or not at this moment in the cycle we actually should be believing the polls.
No, I think Trump can win the nomination, Cruz can win the nomination, and either of them can win the election. These social embarrassment polls aren't going to mean anything on election day.